Hilbourne Watson, and I was fortunate to have Hilbourne as my professor, many years ago at Howard when I was just starting embarking on a development dissertation comparing Southern Africa and Southeast Asia, and was about to start using some of that old dependencies theory stuff going on. And Hilbourne was the one that saved me from myself and pointed out that there's a whole new world developing out here, a whole new literature you need to expose yourself to. And I'm really mightily appreciative of what he helped me in getting on that trajectory and being here with you today. So he's going to talk about the crisis of global capitalism and Hilbourne Watson.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
A little louder, please.
A little louder. Okay, like that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. A good deal has been said here over the past 2 days about the crisis of global capitalism, and I'm not going to dwell on that because there's a lot that I want to talk about, and there are two concerns I have here. One is to pay attention to what I call the historical origins of global white supremacy, and the second is to pay attention to what I call the staying power of global white supremacy as a norm of world order as opposed to preoccupation with phenotype. Because I think it's the power relations that really make sense and will take this issue beyond what is more commonly emphasized. Right? Now, if you will bear with me then to that end, I'd like to begin by focusing on the work of Theodore Allen, who did that magisterial work on the origins and making of the white race. And it's Jeffrey B. Perry who has done a lot of work on Allen and, of course, on Hubert Harrison from the Carbine. And my point of departure here then is the following, if you bear with me. Now, drawing on his research on Theodore Allen and Hubert Harrison, Jeffrey Perry argues that the policies and practices that were instituted in the slave states in North America starting in the 17th century to achieve certain political outcomes, right? That there are certain policies that were instituted to that end. Perry quotes Theodore Allen saying, quote, in the latter half of the 17th century, Virginia and Maryland, the tobacco colonies, Afro-American and European-American proletarians made common cause in this struggle to an extent never duplicated in the 300 years since. Allen notes that, quote, the plantation bourgeoisie established a system of social control by the institutionalization of the white race, whereby the mass of poor whites was alienated from the black proletariat and enlisted as enforcers of bourgeois power. Allen elaborates, the record indicates that the laboring class of European Americans in the continental plantation colonies showed little interest in the white identity business before the institution of the system of race privileges at the end of the 17th century. He points out that, quote, their poor white owned the position of the poor whites vis-a-vis the rich and powerful was not the least improved, but weakened by the white-skin privilege system. Allen continues, and he contends that, quote, the white race is the historically most general form of class collaboration. He insists that the white race must be understood not simply as a social construct, but as a ruling class social control formation. Remember, following this point here, Marx noted in the so-called Primitive Accumulation, Part 8, Volume 1 of Capital, that a white skin could not be considered free so long as a black skin remained as chattel. He was emphatic that the working class has an important role in the struggle for human emancipation that extends to combating and overthrowing white supremacy and overcoming other obstacles that make it difficult to live as full human beings. Now, having said that, I'd like to go back here to some points developed by Gerald Horne in his latest book published by Monthly Review. And Horne argues, bearing in mind what I said, drawing on Allen via Jeffrey Perry, that, quote, the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is the calling card for the gun lobby in Washington, D.C., has everything to do with slavery. When the Second Amendment speaks of militias and speaks of guns, they're expressing a fear of slave revolts. The Second Amendment did not apply to enslaved Africans. It did not apply to the indigenous population. In fact, it could be considered a capital offense at the time to sell weapons to the Native Americans, since the European settlers were seeking to take their land. Now, Horne argues that unresolved issues of racism and an inadequate discussion of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow contribute to a situation where black people are perceived as criminals by the police authorities, which inevitably leads to their slaughter. The state, I argue, is founded on domination, oppression, and violence, and these features are preserved in the cracks and crevices of liberal democracy, which privileges deontological or abstract rights and the alienation of power over what I would call substantive rights that are demandable. In other words, under liberal democracy, there is no what Slavoj Žižek calls non-negotiable ground floor of freedom that can be taken as given. And therefore, the only way, in my judgment, that we can make sense of liberal democracy is to view it as a continuous plebiscite, not as a finished product. The moment you embrace it on the terms that are set forth by the bourgeois order, you're hopelessly lost, in my view. Now, with this said, given how the state was established, I would argue that the violence, including police brutality, that is executed against a lot of unarmed blacks is a form of state-sanctioned violence that is waged against those that are made weak and vulnerable, bearing in mind that these conditions are constructed rather than given. And I therefore reject the liberal assertion about racism being something psychological that inheres in our DNA, so to speak. It's a cop-out and therefore stands against the possibility of fighting for real change. And while anti-racist struggles are part of the struggle of transformation, they cannot suffice to get us where we need to go. And there's this phenomenon I call anti-racist racism that Jean-Paul Sartre talked about in Black Orpheus in 1946, in which he arrived at the conclusion that the anti-racist struggle was the way to lead the colonized and other oppressed people out of their predicament. And I take exception to that because I think what anti-racist racism does is it expresses outrage at egregious acts of brutality, but upholds the institutional system that makes those things possible. And once you understand that, you know you have to move beyond that particular predicament. Now, I would argue here with all of that as context that white supremacy received a boost with the rise of what I call racial Anglo-Saxonism in England in the context of colonial expansion and empire building that laid the foundation for the modern European international system. The white supremacy phenomenon then is going to include ethnic variants of racial whiteness that expose it as anything but integral and monolithic. Horne discusses the problem of the production of white supremacy in his account of how Scots and Irish people, both of whom were oppressed by the English ruling class and later made their junior partners. His argument is that the Act of Union of 1707 made it feasible for certain Scots to reap benefits from the colonial and enslaving feast, while important differences between England and Scotland remain unresolved. He stresses that the Republicans in North America managed to slice the Gordian knot rather neatly by creating a kind of aristocracy of whiteness by which Europeans of various stripes could be accommodated as against the interests of the dispossessed indigenes and the Africans. The pursuit of the material interests and political needs of the English ruling colonists forced them to make certain concessions that resulted in cultivating a new identity of whiteness, or what Horne calls the leapfrogging of ethnic boundaries and constraints. Now, the Irish and Scottish recruits benefit from the expanding military and coercive power of the English state in the New World colonies. The arrival in the Americas of enslaved Africans then represented what Horne calls a horrible leap for constructions of race that preceded what he calls the bloody 17th century. The invention of whiteness in this sense, then, has had a checkered history in which certain ethnic whites disparage others, confirming that the accommodation of Europeans of various stripes preserves certain contradictions within the dominant power relations through which white supremacy came to life. Now, if you're familiar with Reginald Hornsman's book on Manifest Destiny, he connects the expansion of white supremacy to the importation of racial Anglo-Saxonism into the early republic of the United States by the founding fathers. Now, he discusses what Aryans, so-called Aryans, understood as the preordained western trajectory of the sun, a metaphor for reason, consciousness, and civilizational progress that rose first in the steppes of Asia, it was argued, and moved into the western zones of Europe, where it settled at high noon and was ultimately transported across the Atlantic, completing its cycle in a Hegelian sense under the guidance of the protection of a supposedly superior ethnic group of Aryan German types. Now, the English strain of this racial Anglo-Saxonism was fundamentally unsympathetic to the notion of an undifferentiated, quote, Caucasian racial identity, because the English asserted that they descended from a pure racial group that did not experience interbreeding, they did not mix with other ethnic groups, they were never subjugated, only the Norman conquest became an inconvenience, as it were. And Horstman argues that and they had to get over that the original Anglo-Saxon doctrine emphasized institutions such as government, religion, parliamentary bodies during the 18th and 19th centuries. However, attention shifted from a continuity of institutions to a continuity of innate racial strengths, the body, guided by the belief that superior racial characteristics engender equivalent racial and cultural political institutions. So the institutions then are derivative of the racial body, if you will. Right? Now, racial Anglo-Saxons believe that persons deemed to be from inferior racial stock would inevitably create weak institutions. Now, the ideology itself, this is implicated in the racialization of practically everything from nature, geography, to biology, culture, history, law, property rights, concepts of freedom, and every aspect of social existence became the basis for assigning value and importance to some groups by characterizing them as civilized while dehumanizing others and characterizing them as savages or barbarians. Now, if you're familiar with Kenan Malik's book, The Meaning of Race, you understand Malik's engagement with the Enlightenment liberals who said that we're one humanity, we may be divided geographically and by language and so on, and tradition and customs, but at the end we're one. But then the Enlightenment liberals, whether they were the French component, the English, or whatever, whichever one you choose, had to address the question of inequality. They said that's when we turn to race. And Malik says, now here's the problem with that. It is not race that gives rise to inequality, but it is the economic capitalist organization of society that informs the racial classification of humanity. And I think this is a very powerful argument. But by the time we move into the 19th century, as Malik points out, the intellectuals, the organic intellectuals of racial Anglo-Saxons began to emphasize things like degeneracy, pessimism, family, tradition, religion, feeling, emotion, and other notions, romantic notions that help to legitimate scientific racism and normalize white supremacy. Horstman's argument is that such romantic themes contributed to what he calls, quote, a fuzziness of thought and the uniqueness of peculiar qualities of individuals and peoples, especially persons from European stock. Romanticists like Ernest Renan, Gustave Le Bon, Johann Gottfried von Herder emphasized concepts like national spirit, national culture, and national language that resonated with those individuals that imagined themselves to be of this superior Teutonic Anglo-Saxon racial stock. They then traced their history to Germanic tribes that lived racially uncontaminated lives in the forests, from which they emerged in Tacitus Germania at the time of the Roman invasion of of England, over there at Dover, is where the cliffs are still white. Now, racial Anglo-Saxonists fetishize, and they are. If you go there today, you'll see they're still white. Right? The white cliffs have been white for a long time, right? Now, racial Anglo-Saxons fetishize retrospective illusions, right? Focusing on what Etienne Balibar calls the, he refers to the retrospective illusions of the national personality, right? In which these folk read history backward through a logic of historical time, right, to a point of origin that did not begin. So if there's an origin without an origin, then how do you trace history? And once you go there, you empty history or render it emptyable, and then it is impossible to construct a discourse on the basis of what I call facticity. Right? And therefore, the bogusness that inheres so much in these, what I call cottage industries, like white supremacy and other forms of supremacy, they are exactly what they are. Now, how am I doing for time, Jerry? Am I okay? I'm doing all right? Okay, okay, all right. Now, there's a lot I want to cover, right? Yeah. So now Horseman, a little bit more air on Horseman. Horseman contends that the German Romantic movement, a 19th century movement, spawned followings in Europe and America that were, quote, to jumble race, nation, and language into a hodgepodge of rampant racial nationalism. The ideologues of the German Romantic movement imagined themselves standing atop the human cultural edifice, miraculously imbued with superior Anglo-Saxon genes that equipped them to rule over the world. During the 18th and 19th centuries then, we witnessed the gelling of sentiments that morphed into an ideology of a Germanic-derived Anglo-Saxon racial nationalism. Racial Anglo-Saxonism, then, is a racialized nationalism that ascribes cultural and other characteristics to certain groups without adducing one shred of supporting empirical evidence for the existence of distinct human races. And this is a point that Bruce Baum makes in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Caucasian Race, in which he says that this notion of a Caucasian race as a concrete type does not stand the test of empirical verification. Horseman then emphasizes that Herder's preoccupation with language as the basis of nationality and his emphasis on the common past of a people, his way of trafficking in retrospective illusions, contributed to what Horseman calls virulent racial theories. Herder replaced the nation as a political civic construct bound by a social contract with the notion of the nation that was imagined to be naturally evolved, a linguistic cultural community with unique individuality. German Romantics folded cultural and political nationalism into a unitary form that appeals to a past without a historical point of origin, what I call disembodied history. The racialized nationalism, then, that informed the Romantic movement embraced a particularistic organicism as a reaction to the cosmopolitanism of the Enlightenment that emphasized the universalistic values of a territorial civic nation state, which a lot of people trace to the making of the French Revolution in Europe and its principles. Thus, state, nation, culture, race, and language that were taken to offer providential evidence of a divine purpose became the rallying cries against the ideas of universalistic, of Enlightenment universalism. So I'd like to turn now to where I engage these issues of what I call, if you take what I have just said to be a way of trying to construct some arguments on the making of this white supremacy discourse within the framework of modernity, bearing in mind what David Theodore Goldberg says in his book on the racial state published by Blackwell in 2002, where he says that liberalism is heavily invested in a host of problems that are preserved in the contemporary neoliberal project. Right? So hold that and let me switch to what I call an attempt to demystify the staying power of global white supremacy as a hegemonic norm of world And here I will draw on some concrete issue aspects of experience in former British colonies in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Guyana, and several others, right? Now, what is interesting here for me is that the tendency among nationalist intellectuals is to assume that colonialism and imperialism represented a purely external imposition that remained, as it were, always outside, dominating something else. I reject that on the grounds that sooner or later these become internalized. And many of the victims internalize those values. They're reflected in the behavior of the people who led the decolonization movement and brought those countries into independence. In other words, I see as what I call a false inside-outside dichotomy the logic of simply an external imposition. How do you bring Christianity of the Anglican Church into the West Indies? How do you bring British military structures, security structures, administrative structures? And these are the bases through which everyday life is conducted, and simply say it's purely external. After a while, that logic doesn't stand critical exposure, if you will, right? Now, earlier this morning, I was talking to my colleague here and a couple of others about a point that the late Scottish historian Victor G. Kiernan made in The Lords of Humankind. And he said in that book that the Europeans expressed tremendous amazement at how easy it was for them to get along with the leaders of the people they oppressed and dehumanized for several centuries. And his point was, and he quotes the English saying, we were pleasantly surprised that we had succeeded at exactly what we wanted to do. Deal with men who were black and brown in complexion, but English in values and worldview. And that is precisely what happened across the British West Indies. It happened, and then Gordon K. Lewis wrote The Main Currents of Caribbean Thought. He said that the Caribbean era is an era that needs to go through psychological decolonization. Whether it's the Haitian in Paris, or the Martinican, or the Guadeloupean, or the Barbadian in London, as the case may be, or the Puerto Rican in wherever they may be. And of course, there's always a risk of overgeneralizing, but strategically, these people have seen themselves in a very different way. You can't talk about something called a Caribbean nationalism in the singular. It really makes no sense on the basis of evidence. You understand why it is that Haitians have a particular, the foreign mass of Haitians have a particular worldview, working class Haitians, Creoles Haitians have a view of Haiti and the world that is in many ways quite different from that of their rulers, right? And we have seen over, if we step back for a moment and go back to Cuba, and I have gotten into a lot of trouble with a lot of my Cuban friends over Jose Marti. And Jose Marti advanced a notion of what he called racist patriotism. And that was used strictly to get the support of the ethnic white Cubans. And if you go back to the making of the Revolutionary Wars of Independence leading to Cuban independence, Antonio Maceo, who was an Afro-Cuban, he was denied the generalship he deserved by Jose Marti on the grounds that Marti feared that they would try to set up a black republic in Cuba. Why? 2/5 of the leadership of the revolutionary movement in Cuba were black at the time. And Marti went to northern Haiti to meet Antoine Fury with one thing in mind, following the Haitian Revolution. This was the 1850s. Is it true that blacks cannot govern themselves? And if we were to have blacks playing a major role in the post-revolutionary Cuba, what would be the state of Cuba? And you've got this in a man who became the patron saint of the Cuban Revolution, right? And who preserved many of what I would call the anti-racist, racist sentiments in his particular outlook, that this notion of a racist patriotism did not really, address in any fundamental way, right? Now, so I want to make a few points here. Now, when Kiernan made the argument that the Europeans were so greatly surprised that they could work with the people who led those who had been so brutalized for so long, he said the interesting point we need to keep in mind is that the savages and barbarians that the Europeans thought it was their duty to rout in the colonies Their counterpart were the working class in the British factories. And qualitatively, they made no major distinction between them. So though you have the racialization of everything, there is a clear understanding that for the English ruling class, in this context, it was class and it was not race. But it is, you have to racialize if you're going to nationalize in that particular sense. And remember this, the point that Hitler had made in the 1930s when he had a conference with a leading German agro-industrialist who said, Führer, you keep talking about race. Do you believe in race? He says, look, I don't believe in any race. I know as well as all the intellectuals in the leading German universities that race is a fiction. But I have a plan. And the plan for a pure Germany, German people, involves racializing. And therefore the Jews must be seen as a virus, and this is an infection of the body, and we've got to get it out. And all the other groups that are part of, whether the Gypsies, the Roma, or whoever else, we've got to purge, right? So he says, I'm not into this, but I have to promote a racial theory of history because it serves the interests that I have. So now, briefly, in this English-speaking Carbine, we've had 1945, the founding of the Carbine Labour Congress at Barbados, out of this coming together of the various labour movements in the islands. And at that conference, Bradley Adams, who was the head of the Barbados Labour Party at the time, argued that the only hope for the Carbine was the establishment of what he called a socialist Carbine Commonwealth to tackle the major problems facing the world. 3 years later, at the special meeting of the UN in Paris, France, Adams, who was selected by the British to be a part of their delegation to the conference, got up and denounced every socialist, Marxist, communist, leftist, right there in public, for all of the colonies, arguing that these had nothing to offer for the future of humanity. 3 years later, the British awarded him with a knighthood, and he became Sir Brantley Adams, the highest achievement he thought that any person could get anywhere in the world, right? Now, in 1952, Alexander Bustamante, who headed the local government, the colonial government in Jamaica at the time, and was head of the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, attended a conference in London on self-government for Jamaica. And at the end of the conference, Mr. Bustamante issues a statement. He says, I know as well as anybody else that the British have done some horrible things in the world. But the fact remains, there is no prospect of any democracy anywhere in the world without a resilient British Empire. And here's a guy who is leading a colony towards self-government and independence, who says we need British imperialism to have democracy. And then Michael Manley's father, Norman Washington, and Eric Williams of Trinidad, these are names you're familiar with, declared in the 50s that the democracy that works so well in England for everybody is exactly what we need in the British West Indies going forward. So the emphasis was on continuity, not rupture or break. The point here is what I call the investment of all of these folk in global white supremacy as the norm of world order. It doesn't represent itself phenotypically because in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the stench of fascism was still in the cracks and crevices of everything, and as these West Indians began to trek to England in large numbers after 1948 and discovered that there was no black in the Union Jack. It was one thing to be a subject of the British Empire, but a different thing to be considered a full person in that particular environment. And it was in that sort of context then that there's this rude awakening of what they then must reimagine. And the British did everything to order and direct decolonization and independence in the British Carbine to the point where they effectively succeeded. Now, my nationalist friends, whether they're at the University of the West Indies or wherever they might be, take exception to what I'm arguing on the claim that they demanded independence and got it on their own terms. It simply did not happen. That's part of the, I call it the investment in the moral epistemology of imperialism that masquerades as something other than itself, if you will, right? Now, the last point I want to make here. Errol Barrow, first Prime Minister of Barbados, born 1920, died 1987. he tried to trace the democratic institutions of Barbados to 17th century semi-feudal absolutism of the House of Stuart. And he insisted that the English bequeath all these democratic institutions to the colonies that moved them forward. And in the 1970s, when something called the Black Power movement had gained some visibility in the Caribbean and had some connections to the movement in North America and the United States, he reminded all of the Pan-Africanists that the cultural institutions and political institutions of Barbados were English, not African. And in a certain sense, it's absolutely true. Right? It was true, but the folk were arguing we need to turn the tables. What I'm arguing is whether there's a Barrow of Barbados, a Manley of Jamaica, a Williams of Trinidad, or Bradshaw of St. Kitts, or whatever other territory, these were all very deeply invested in white supremacy as the norm of world order, right? And making sense of that, it seems to me, is critical to understanding the practices, the behavior, and the attitudes of those individuals. And it wasn't limited to the Caribbean. You deal with continental Africa, which is a different situation because you've got vast majorities of people inhabiting vast expanses of land who have got their cultures and their history. And of course, if you go to the Kenyan scholar Ngugi, Wathiongo Ngugi, who argues for the indigenization of the African traditions to overcome the impositions from that were set upon them by the Europeans, including the English in particular, right? And but my argument is that you could do that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you achieve what you're looking for. The fundamental point here, and this is where I'll end, unless we have an understanding of the importance of the universal or universality, it is impossible to construct viable struggles for freedom and liberation. At the end of the day, the real patriot is a person for whom the world is his or her community, not the territorial space. Now that is where you happen to inhabit by accidents of history or whatever other factors there may be. But because the world is so much bigger, I'm reminded of what I think was St. Victor said back in the 12th century. The man who thinks that his village is the world is lost. The man who thinks that his town is the world is still lost. The man who thinks that his country is his world is rising to consciousness. And the man who thinks that the world is his home is the real man. Thank you.